Well, I don't know about you, but as I watched last Saturday's news coverage of events in Charlottesville, about all my imagination could conjure up was rage and fury and bright, hot visions of doing bodily harm to the bullies and thugs I believe make up the core of neo-Nazi and ultra-nationalist groups. Isn't that pastoral of me? I was finishing getting the house in order for the overnight stay of last week's speaker, Gordon Gibson, and his wife, Judy, when someone texted me to turn on the news. I spent the next hour before Gordon and Judy's arrival ranting at the television, occasionally rising and stomping around the house, and then ranting some more. My dogs headed full tilt to another part of the house to wait out my tantrum, which ended with my loud proclamation that the driver of that car that plowed murderously into the crowd should be killed, should be put to death. Now, I am an avid opponent of capital punishment, have been for a very long time, and I am also largely a pacifist. My fury didn't exactly shock me, and honestly, it took a few minutes for me to feel as appalled as I eventually became at my loudly expressed wish for death to that car driver. My desire to do bodily harm to the bad guys, let's call them, even though I eschew violence in almost all forms, is familiar, born out of the powerlessness of being the youngest child and only girl in a male-dominated household. I've shared with you before that my dad struggled with rage, and as happens, his struggles shaped my brothers and me. Anger and even rage are not unfamiliar to me, but the rage doesn't show up very often anymore, having become sublimated by a growing desire as I matured to learn, to understand, to care, and sometimes even to love. Soul growth is how I think of it, and I've worked hard to grow my soul from that feisty but powerless little girl who hated bullies with passion and fervor and red-hot zeal to someone who could wonder about them and learn about them and sometimes even feel sorry for them, as Ruby Bridges felt sorry for those who persecuted her at the age of 6. I eventually calmed down last Saturday, fortunately before the Gibsons arrived, and when calmer, spent some time wondering again, as I have wondered so many times before, what motivates those who hate? What draws people to join hate groups? What impels them to want to batter or expel those who are different from them? My curiosity is more than theoretical. 4+ years ago now, on Martin Luther King Sunday, I told you of my grandfather. Let me read to you from that sermon. My grandfather carried a coin purse and gave away quarters and nickels and poured pop for us into glass glasses painted with yellow and red flowers. In the summers, he napped on a glider in his tiny screened-in front porch. In the winters, he watched TV in his swivel rocker in the living room and inserted dollar bills into birthday cards signed in wavering script. My grandfather was hard of hearing, but wouldn't admit it, and we had to shout at him to make ourselves heard. Even then, he smiled and nodded a lot, unable to catch all of our chatter. We visited him weekly for about a half an hour at a time, and on holidays he came to our house for turkey dinner. He was tall and very thin, with a full head of fine, wispy white hair. My grandfather belonged to the Ku Klux Klan. That's what I told you 4 years ago, and I'd like to tell you a little more about that now. I didn't know of my grandfather's Klan involvement until I was a young adult, and I'm grateful to say that. And I never learned more about it than that. He was once a Klansman. I was a late arriving grandchild, and he was beyond active or spoken prejudice in my company, at least, by the time I was old enough to understand language. I do know, though, that if his Klan participation took place while he lived in Elkhart, my hometown in Indiana, it would not have been unusual. Though I don't know the specific statistics for Elkhart, in 1925, 20.8% of adult white males living in Indiana belonged to the Klan, and this figure is believed to be down a bit from a few years prior. It is said that in 1922, Indiana had the largest Klan membership in the nation, and over half of the elected members of the state General Assembly, as well as many local government leaders, belonged to the Klan. It is also quite clear that a number of ministers and congregations were involved, churches. Last week, our pulpit guest, Gordon Gibson, mentioned sundown towns, those towns in which people of color were advised to vacate before sundown. The small town of Goshen, Indiana, 11 miles southeast of Elkhart and home to a large Mennonite community, including a Mennonite liberal arts school called Goshen College, was one of those sundown towns. For those of you not familiar with the Mennonites, they are kind of middle ground between the Amish and the Church of the Brethren, the latter being the church in which I was raised, although we were not particularly active in our participation. The Mennonites are historically a peace church, a designation given specifically to 3 denominations, including the Mennonites, and that includes the Amish, the Church of the Brethren, and the Society of Friends, or Quakers. Being a peace church, being a pacifist denomination, it is interesting to note that the Mennonites also have an exceedingly complex history of fascism and racism, recently described in Benjamin Goossen's book, Chosen Nation. The Church of the Brethren, and to a lesser extent the Quakers, each had their own struggles with race, but to a lesser degree than the Mennonites, and all 3 are currently and have been working to dismantle racism within and without. Still, it's hard for me to reconcile the thought of a peace church with the concept of racism. It's hard for me to reconcile any church with racism, even in light of the struggles of white supremacy within our own denomination. But it's particularly difficult for me to reconcile racism with my knowledge of the now very, very diverse and ardently peace-seeking Mennonites. I came to know the Mennonites quite well, not only because of their proximity to the Church of the Brethren and their tremendous presence in north central Indiana, but because I took a couple of my seminary classes at the Mennonite Seminary in Elkhart, about a mile down from our house, and I often studied at the famously quiet library of the Mennonite Seminary. It was hard for me to learn of the rampant racism in my home state, my hometown, the area's most prevalent religion, my grandfather's past, and I was further shocked and disheartened when I learned of it in a friend. In the 80s, while working as a 911 dispatcher, I became close with a police lieutenant working my shift. I occasionally rode with him on one of my days off, and he would frequently stop into the dispatch center to chat when things were slow. I liked him and respected him a lot. I had seen him speak quietly to his officers, calming them down with just a word or two, during a particularly difficult arrest. I had watched him deal respectfully with suspects and offenders. I knew him to be a caring and effective police officer. But then one day, and I no longer remember the context, he told me that at one point in the not too distant past, a lot of members of the Elkhart Police Department were either members of or sympathizers with the Klan. He became vague when I registered my shock, but left me with the unsettling impression that he may have been among them. Call me naive. I am naive. But I was, if not devastated, saddened, and disillusioned. We did not discuss it further, nor did we discuss much of anything else after that, because though I am more and more coming to understand my position of white privilege and white supremacy in our culture, I don't have the heart for active hate, nor the mind to comprehend purposeful discrimination. I remember learning of racism in grade school and asking my mother why people would be disliked for the color of their skin when they had no choice whatsoever about the color of their skin. They can't help how they were born, I protested. It doesn't make sense. I might have been born with brown skin. My mother, though neither actively racist nor anti-racist, could not answer such questions from her young daughter, and though I eventually learned of the broader issues involved, the basic absurdity of racism has never ceased to baffle me. What I have come to believe, though, is that it all revolves around fear. And when we are able, as hard as it is to do, to think of racism, ultranationalism, and all of those other damaging isms that so deeply offend us and harm us in terms of fear, it makes it easier to get. That's one of the ways we can utilize Nate Walker, his term, the moral imagination, to try to imagine the fear that generates the anger that fuels hate groups. So many hate groups in our country, so many hate groups throughout the world. I addressed this in a letter to the editor, which David Waters told me would be used as an opinion piece next week. I wrote it at the urging of our own Doug Inch, who rightly wishes Neshoba to have a public voice in such matters, and partly because I was hoping it would be used as an opinion piece. I gave it a lot of thought. Here's what I wrote. The Charlottesville travesty troubles us so deeply because we sense that it's only the beginning of a growing movement that puts many of us in mind of a movement that began similarly some 8 decades ago, culminating in the horror of the Holocaust. Some criticize the protesters that confronted the white supremacists, neo-Nazis, ultra-nationalists in Charlottesville. Yet how different history might be had protesters, including the strangely silent churches and clergy, protested Hitler and Nazism. Learning from our history, we know that standing up against bigotry and hatred sooner rather than later may help prevent the terror and genocide that hate groups are capable of spawning. But why hate? What causes us to hate in the first place? I have a theory, and I did not originate it, that fear begets anger, begets hatred, begets fear in a dangerous and ever-expanding cycle. It goes like this. Almost all anger is preceded by a moment, a flash of brief, however brief, of fear. All anger is preceded by fear. One has to try that fact on personally a number of times and think about it deeply and openly without bias to embrace the truth of it. We get angry at a driver who pulls out in front of us because for a second it felt dangerous and scared us, or because we fear it will slow us down when we are running late. We get angry at our child who sasses us because we fear, however briefly, that we are losing control of her, or that if she takes that attitude out into the world, she will get into trouble. She may be hurt. We get angry at immigrants because we fear those who are different, or at blacks if we are white, because perhaps we fear that they will become dominant in our culture, leaving us powerless. We almost always, and this is important, we almost always and immediately then unconsciously turn that fear into anger, because fear leaves us feeling vulnerable and anger leaves us with a sense of power. And most of us value power over vulnerability. This is all so basic to the human condition and so habitual that we do not recognize it unless we are intentional about noticing it. But when we do begin to notice it, it helps us understand anger, which helps us understand hate. We all know there's a lot of hatred in the world, sometimes more hidden than others, and this has always been so. It grows out of evolutionarily sound grounding. Fear kept us out of the clutches of predators of all kinds, including humans of other unknown tribes. But always having to run from or fight predators is exhausting, challenging, and uncertain, and that causes us to become angry, which eventually leads to hatred. Greed, too, rises out of a deep core fear of scarcity, and overcompensation for that fear of scarcity becomes the greed which drives many of our most successful business and political leaders. And because we all share a bit of that fear of scarcity, we often support them in their leadership. Fear cyclically begets anger, which begets hatred, and it all breeds an unwholesome greed. In a country founded on the fear and greed of genocide and enriched on the fear and greed of slavery, the resulting hatred may run deep in our national DNA. I believe it is time to excise it, and taking a stand against hate groups is one very good step in that direction. That's the end of my letter, but the obvious next question is just how best to take that step. Tina Fey had a bit on Saturday Night Live last week. Some of you saw it. A bit now known as sheet caking, which I thought was pretty funny and frankly morally satisfying. In it, she heartily slams hate groups and politicians who don't stand up against them, but makes the point with her brand of humor to just eat cake instead of going to rallies to confront those hate groups. Some have taken offense at her piece, saying she was suggesting ignoring racism and Nazism, and that it displays white privilege to do so. I understand that sentiment, but here's what I also know. In Elkhart, we had several Klan rallies in the 1990s. This was after I had become a Unitarian Universalist and was more active in civil rights efforts. City officials, knowing that a rally was coming, worked with religious leaders to find a way to limit the Klan's audience, which is basically what Tina Fey, with her brand of humor, was saying. Don't give them an audience. What Elkhart leaders did instead was plan fairly extravagant and well-advertised diversity festivals with music, food, games, and contests and other attractions held at a park far removed from the Klan rally. People came to the festivals rather than the rallies. Both Klan rallies had very few onlookers. After it was all over, both times, members of our Unitarian Universalist Church, along with some others, went to the place where the Klan rally had occurred, and with the media forewarned and attentive, used mops and buckets, brooms, and rags to symbolically clean the location where the Klan had stood. It was a powerful statement and healing, and got a lot more coverage than the Klan rally. I don't know if that's always the right course, or if it could work in the venue of a larger city or in these times. Elkhart has a population of around 50,000. I do know that considering such alternative strategies is another good use of the moral imagination. Darkness cannot drive out darkness, Dr. King told us. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate, he said. Only love can do that. We are challenged to live up to his words. Let us work hard in these painful, difficult times to engage our moral imagination in ways that allow us to see and expand the light in the midst of the darkness, and to feel and spread the love in the midst of hate. As difficult as that is, I believe it is our best hope. Amen.